we're really pleased to have Jessica Sun. She's our newest member of the PCMDCB Baltimore Council, and as some people heard me say, she will be leaving us a little bit. She's going to be discerning whether she's got a calling to be a nun. So hopefully she'll be able to stay with us from afar a good bit. So she's going to make the presentation, and then we also have Sister Susan, who had been in Palestine for 6 months, and she was with the EAPPI group. So she's going to be sort of make the first the comment. So we had the discussion. We're going to ask her to make some comments on what Jessica has to say. But Jessica was in Palestine in the November, late November, early December period of last year. So I will let you take it from there, Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Jessica Sun. I'm a member of PCMDCB Baltimore and the Young Adult Caucus. And late November, early December, I went on a 10-day trip in solidarity with Palestinian civil society. So I'll be sharing my experiences on that today. I plan to also show like a short, like 12-minute video that kind of goes over some of the history in Palestine, and then also definition of apartheid and what that means, which is also from 2021. And at the end, I'll be sharing some additional resources as well as 2 calls to action. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right. So here we go. This is a solidarity trip with Palestinian civil society was experienced by myself for 10 days from 26th November to 6th December of last year. So these are some pictures I have of Bethlehem, Palestine, the Bethlehem Peace Center, which is right in the center square. In Bethlehem, right over there, you're seeing the Nativity Church. And the second picture is where we believe Jesus was born. And on the right is another downtown shot of Bethlehem, Palestine. Still beautiful. So I went on the trip. It was with Sabeel, Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center. Their vision is local Palestinian Christians, local Christians inspired by the life and teaching of Jesus to stand for the oppressed, work for justice, and engage in peace building. On the right, I have a copy of one of their awesome literature, published literatures that I purchased, called ecumenical, an inclusive call for nonviolent action to achieve a just peace. Truly an international leader for what it means to be and exist in the creativity that nonviolence requires under extreme circumstances. I also want to include these 2 pictures. The left was just outside Sabeel headquarters in Jerusalem, and on the right is a featured picture, a sketch of some incredible nonviolent leaders like Gandhi and Dorothy Day from Catholic Worker and Martin Luther King. One of the great pleasant surprises to me was seeing how frequently inspirational quotes and messaging from MLK was featured throughout the over a dozen or 2 dozen organizations we went to visit. So the first group that we went with that I want to talk about is 10 of Nations. They are relatively well known internationally compared to a few other of the organizations which were a little bit less known. But the history of the 10 of Nations is that about over 100 years ago, the Nasser family members worked during the day and slept in caves at night on their location. And in 1991, Israeli authorities declared the Nasser family farm and surrounding area as quote unquote state land. The Nasser family owned all of the original land registrations and farmed the land throughout Ottoman, British, Jordanian, and Israeli rule. And out of the family farms and land plots throughout the area, they're considered one of the lucky ones, considering they still have those official documents, as Israeli authorities and military authorities continue to claim illegally more and more Palestinian land. The picture here is one of the first brightly painted signs you're greeted with when you enter Tent of Nations. There used to be a main entrance to the front and a back entrance, but Israeli authorities have blocked off entrance and ability to enter through the front entrance, but this greets you now. Tent of Nations hosts many community building activists for the local children and women. So that was a delight to see there. As you can imagine, the Tent of Nation property, which sits at the top of a mountain, which is typically where Israeli settlers like to build their settlements to see out over everything. Their property and infrastructure has been attacked countless times, again, illegally. But nevertheless, Tent of Nations is committed to living without aggression. They have one of their many inspirational mottos is, "We refuse to be enemies," and they hope for a better future. They try to overcome their numerous obstacles, challenges, the continued destructions and the attacks on their lives in a peaceful, nonviolent way, based on their Christian values and trusting in God's justice. They've made great strides in aiming to be self-sufficient in regards to collecting water and electricity, since their infrastructure and access keeps getting cut off. On the right here is a picture of myself on the most right and the 5 others who were with me on this trip. This was Sabeel's first trip to Palestine post-pandemic. Daoud Nasser is second from the right there. He's the owner and direct descendant of the Nasser family. And we're meeting outside what they called Melade's Cave, which is a natural room with cooling properties on the farm, commonly used as a meeting room. Over here is just a closer picture of one of the painted murals, the many community painted murals throughout Tent of Nations of Melade's Cave. And inside you can see many languages featured, and that is to emphasize the international presence, community, and support. Visitors from all over the world have shown Tent of Nations as they continue to face insurmountable odds, seemingly insurmountable odds, day after day. Among their many moving guiding principles include refusing to be victims, refusing to hate, believing in justice, and choosing to act differently towards creative nonviolence. On the right here is another stone near the remaining open entrance of Tent of Nations, reading, "We refuse to be enemies," in Arabic, English, and German. Their community-based programs have a variety of different offerings. They host children's summer camps focused on fostering a place where children can discover their blessed talents. They implement women empowerment projects in neighboring villages to bring women out of their homes. And they produce harvests with volunteers and family locally at the Tent of Nations farm and from around the world. I wanted to take this moment to also bring in some current events in Jerusalem. There is an article here, Anti-Christian Incidents Are on the Rise. I'll have it linked. It's from American Magazine in June 2023. Even when I was there in November, December, spitting attacks or literal beatings of obviously Christian clergy were increasing, especially in the city of Jerusalem, which has close proximity with the 3 major religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And here's a quote from one of the Christian clergy currently residing in Jerusalem, sharing that it's much worse than 20 years ago, when a spitting incident would happen once every 6 months. Now it has become a daily thing, including for young seminarians studying Jerusalem. So now that we've had a little bit of an introduction to the incredible peacemaking and nonviolent efforts by Palestinians in Palestine, I wanted to share this video, about 12 minutes, that goes over the definition of apartheid and more details about what it means to be living in Palestine right now. You'll notice that one of the definitions of apartheid includes claiming land, and you might see some similarities with the description there to what the Nasser family has been dealing with since 1991 in 10 of Nations.
Many people think of Israel and Palestine as two countries at war, with this one, a state for Jewish people, occupying this one here, where Palestinians live. The truth is, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians live all over this territory, ruled by one government and one army, based on the idea of
advancing the supremacy and domination of one group of people, Jews.
And that is what guides its policies and its practices towards Palestinians.
In other words, apartheid. Apartheid is a loaded word tied to the racist South African regime of white minority rule. But although the word comes from there, apartheid isn't just a description of what happened in South Africa. It's actually a crime against humanity under international law. In 2021, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of carrying out apartheid. It based this accusation on the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute, which say that three elements have to occur for the crime of apartheid to apply. They are an intent by one group to dominate the other, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts, like denying people the right to leave and to return to their country, expropriation of landed property, and the creation of separate reserves and ghettos. So let's see if any of these apply to Israel's rule over Palestinians.
About half of the people that live here under Israel's rule are Palestinian, and the other half are Jews, like myself.
For those 7 million Israeli Jews, almost the entire land is one space. Whether they're here, or here, they have the same rights, privileges, and legal status. They can move freely, vote in the same elections, and live under the same laws. The boundaries are invisible to them. But for the 7 million Palestinians, the boundaries are very visible. Whereas this is essentially one space for Israelis, Palestinians have been divided into 4 areas. Each area gets a different colored ID card issued by Israel, and your life and rights are determined by that ID card. In Gaza, Palestinians have no freedom of movement and are under a complete Israeli blockade. Israel no longer has soldiers inside Gaza, but it controls every aspect of life from the outside. People in Gaza have no civil or political rights. They've got no say in the Israeli government that controls them. Palestinians in the West Bank also have very limited freedom of movement, with their population divided into 165 disconnected cantons, cut off by Israeli military checkpoints, walls, settlements, and other infrastructure. They also have no civil or political rights in Israel. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians generally have more freedom to move, but Israel can take away their right to live in the city. They can't vote in Israeli elections, and Israel also bars them from taking part in Palestinian politics. Palestinians who are citizens of Israel can travel relatively freely, but they face restrictions on where they can live. They can vote in Israeli elections, but face legalized discrimination. Yara Hawari is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship.
This ID system, it penetrates, all areas of life, where you live, where you study, what you work, etc. Even the more intimate areas of life, such as who you marry.
That's because for the most part, a Palestinian can't pass on their ID status to their spouse.
And this has huge implications on where they can live. Many indeed actually end up leaving and choosing to live abroad because it is that difficult.
On rare occasions, Palestinians are able to change their ID, but only in one direction.
So for instance, if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem moves somewhere else inside the West Bank, they could lose their residency in East Jerusalem. And Israel, since it's considered that a downgrade, then that's a direction that would be feasible. And further down the line, again, from Israel's perspective, if West Bankers move to the Gaza Strip, then that's a direction that Israel will accept, but not in the opposite direction.
So while Palestinians are granted different rights based on their IDs, nowhere do those rights match those of Israeli Jews. Looks like we can check off at least one of the elements required for apartheid to apply. When Israel was founded in 1948, 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been forced out. The result was that the new state had a Jewish majority. To maintain that majority, Israel has never allowed the refugees to return. The Palestinians who remained were given Israeli citizenship, although they were kept under strict military rule for 19 years. But in 1967, when Israel occupied more lands, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it faced a problem. It wanted the land, but didn't want the Palestinians on that land. So it's refused to extend citizenship to the rest of the Palestinians under its control, while keeping them under military rule ever since. To further control the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews, Israel still bans Palestinian refugees and their descendants from moving into any of the territories it controls, while encouraging any Jewish person anywhere in the world to immigrate to Israel, even if they've never set foot there before. In Jerusalem, the Israeli authorities actually have a population target: 60% Jews to 40% Palestinians. Palestinians in Jerusalem are only granted a permanent residency permit, even if they've been living in the city since before Israel was founded.
About 350,000 Palestinians are in that status, and which is Orwellian the way it's defined, because the only thing permanent in permanent residency is that it can actually always be taken away.
These permits can be revoked if a Palestinian moves out of the city, but Jewish Israelis living in Jerusalem never lose residency, even if they move to the other side of the world. This discrimination has been enshrined in Israeli law. The 2018 nation-state law says that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. That means that even Palestinians with Israeli citizenship aren't considered equal to Jews with Israeli citizenship. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it, Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people, and only them. So let's go back to that list from before. The nation-state law is only one of many Israeli laws that explicitly discriminate against Palestinians. For example, there's the 1950 Absentees Property Law. Deeming Palestinian refugees absentees, Israel seized hundreds of thousands of acres of their land, even though they were only absent because Israel wouldn't let them return. Remember, denying people the right to return to their country is on the list of inhumane acts that legally make up the third element of apartheid. There are more Israeli policies that could fall under the category of inhumane acts, especially when it comes to land.
So Israel desires the land, even more so desires empty land, or land that it makes empty, and doesn't desire the Palestinians living on that land. And that has resulted in policies in which land is constantly moving in one direction. Land that used to be Palestinian becomes state land, and then that land is allocated for the development of towns and communities for Jewish citizens.
And yes, expropriation of land is also an inhumane act. So let's see what that looks like on the ground. Across the entire territory, Palestinian communities are overcrowded and surrounded by Jewish-only communities.
It's the same type of practice of encircling Palestinian communities so that they can't expand, cutting them off from one another. It's a continuous practice that began in 1948 and was expanded to the West Bank in 1967.
The Israeli state prioritizes Jewish development in places where it wants to restrict the growth of Palestinian communities, with the government keen to Judaize areas like the Galilee and the Negev.
Israeli politicians frequently use that term to Judaize an area, in other words, to ensure Israeli Jewish dominance in a particular area, where the government has a concern over the Palestinian demography. And in any other context, this would be condemned as, gross ethnic engineering. It's in its basic laws, which is essentially the Israeli constitution. The land is deemed for the Jewish people, not the Israeli people, but the Jewish people.
In fact, only 3% of the land inside Israel's 1948 borders is allocated for its Palestinian citizens. Meanwhile, hundreds of new communities have been built for its Jewish citizens, many on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. Plus, there's the 200 illegal Jewish settlements that have been built across the West Bank as well. At the same time, thousands of Palestinian homes have been demolished or are under threat of demolition, having been built without permits because Israel rejects most Palestinian building applications. Meanwhile, in the Negev desert, the Israeli government wants to maximize the land available for Jewish development. So it has tried to force Palestinian Bedouin citizens into small townships by demolishing their homes and not allowing them to connect to the water and power grids. One village, El Arakib, has been demolished more than 180 times.
Now, just across the Green Line, a similar struggle is taking place in the village of Susia, which is in the West Bank, just south of Hebron. And it too has faced a series of mass demolitions by authorities in an attempt to establish Israeli Jewish control over the area.
Looks like we can check off another one of the criteria for apartheid. Israel has total control of this entire territory. Even in Gaza and the West Bank, which have some limited autonomous Palestinian administration in place, Israel controls the borders, trade, resources, water, electricity, the airspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, the population registry, and more. Accusing a government of carrying out a crime against humanity like apartheid is no simple matter. But we've seen how Israel's control over and discrimination against Palestinians fits the legal threshold for apartheid. Israel's own leaders knew this was happening, although they didn't do much to stop it.
The state that you have at the moment is an apartheid state, isn't it?
It's not yet apartheid, but it might come on this slippery slope toward apartheid.
Still, how could apartheid apply to Israel when, say, Palestinian citizens can vote?
So, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I cannot question the fundamental constitution of Israel, which says that the state is for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. My citizenship doesn't allow for inclusion in that state, and so therefore participation in Israeli elections or in the Knesset is really nominal and has no potential to change policy.
Another argument against the accusation of apartheid is that the occupation is only temporary, and when it ends, Palestinians will rule themselves.
Normal people don't think that 54 years is temporary. We've passed that line already a very long time ago. And yeah, there's a lot of Israeli propaganda insisting on that worldview of democracy plus temporary occupation. No, it's not a democracy and it's not a temporary occupation. It's one regime between the river and the sea, and that regime is apartheid.
All right. Let me jump back to the presentation here. So, quite a sobering documentary explainer about apartheid and the definition of it, but I wanted to be sure to include that to provide more context on the history and just a little bit more about the daily lived experience of living while Palestinian in 2023. So the next group I want to feature was the Palestine Museum of Natural History. I thought this was a group and Biodiversity Institute that really stuck out to me while there. So to introduce, the main person is Dr. Mazin Kumsia. He was previously at Duke and Yale Universities, I think also Tennessee, and is presently at the Bethlehem University, of which this Palestine Biodiversity Institute is under. Him and his wife met in the US in academia, and they returned to Palestine in 2008. Together, the both of them have personally donated over $250,000 to the Palestine Museum of Natural History and have been full-time volunteers 7 days a week, 14 to 16 hours a day since its founding 8 years ago. They're focused on research, education, and conservation, have community gardens, and so much more. It's Palestine's first natural history museum where both biodiversity and hope flourish in community. So on the right is another group photo of us. Dr. Mazin Kumsia is third from the right, and this is the rest of the Sabeel Solidarity Group in one of the meeting rooms within the Palestine Museum of Natural History. Here is one of the pamphlets that they have put together that educates on the climate impacts of buildings and vehicles, especially under occupation. Since Israel built the border walls and the many, many checkpoints that Palestinians have to wait through and sit through in the morning can be hours. It just depends. You don't know the likelihood that your car in particular will get stopped and searched on your way to work in usually Israeli territory. It can be maybe a 3 to 4 hour commute sometimes of just sitting there stalling. And so the Palestine Museum of Natural History has focused on that, especially the environmental impacts of it. Here is some pictures of the museum itself. So on the left is some of the museum's community gardens where local families can plant and harvest different vegetables and herbs together. On the right is an inside of their aquaponic farm, which is a method of growing plants and fish together sustainably in a circulating closed system. I thought this was particularly awesome because even under occupation, with very few resources and almost no funding, this museum still creates a space for Palestinians to come together as a community for peace and healing, as you can see in some of these beautifully painted murals as well. So next, a wonderful opportunity we had was, as a group, in our fairly small group, was to sit down with Jeff Halper, who is a Jewish Israeli-American anthropologist, originally from Ohio. Minnesota. And he moved from Minnesota to Israel in 1973. And he is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, as well as a co-founder of the One Democratic State campaign, which is advocating for a democratic one-state solution, which is one civic state with two natural ethnic groups, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. So oftentimes we hear talk about a two-state solution, but in regards to where the occupation and apartheid is at today, the path forward is a one civic state. And so Jeff Halper is a big academic, so he discussed that with us. He also emphasized some other key academic points with us, describing and understanding Zionism as a form of settler colonialism, one of the only modern examples we see of that happening right now. Zionism began in the 1880s and considered the indigenous people irrelevant. Their goal was to transform an Arab country to a Jewish country in this unilateral direction that we are entitled to take over the country because no one of importance is living there. He emphasized as well using the right terms when talking about occupation, that this is not a conflict, this is settler colonialism. And there are not two different sides. There are the invaders and the resistance. So I thought he provided a very, very interesting perspective. So the last main thing I want to talk about today was Military Court Watch. This was also a group we sat down with personally. We sat down with two lawyers that came. And this really stayed in my heart for a long time in their descriptions of what was happening to the children, especially, and this kind of engineered psychological destruction of the Palestinian social fabric. So intentional and so evil in so many ways, at least how I felt after listening to their testimony. So Military Court Watch was established in 2013 by a small group of lawyers and other professionals with belief in the rule of law. First, all children detained by the Israeli military authorities are entitled to all the rights and protections guaranteed under international law. Secondly, that there can be no legal justification for treating Palestinian and Israeli children differently under Israel's military and civilian legal systems. So MCW is kind of unique out of different groups that we talked with and sat with, is that they're not necessarily pro-Palestine or pro-Israel. MCW squarely puts itself as pro-rule of law, and in this case, especially in regards to the treatment of children in military court. We actually went and attended a military court with the MCW lawyer, Sawa, as silent observers. We personally, on the day we came, were denied entry to all but one case based on a new rule instituted a month earlier, which apparently stated that civilians cannot witness cases with minors without parental permission, even though Palestinian parents are not given notice of the trial. ahead of time. Many times, Palestinian parents would just wait outside in the case that their child's case will be brought up that day. I'm going to skip past these for now in regards to time, but here are just some wonderful murals in one of the refugee camps we visited about that kind of brings together two isolated communities, as you saw in the video, an important part of keeping the Palestinian populace's, I guess, hope down is to separate them and encircle them. And so that's kind of, I think, a dream, as well as a feature of Shireen Abu Akleh, who is an American citizen in Palestine, who was murdered by the Israeli army during a journalist report. But you may have heard of that, but I'm going to go past this for now and talk more about MCW and the Military Court Watch. And so these were some of the points really emphasized by the NCW British lawyers, Dave and Salwa, about what it takes to engineer psychological terror. How does one country become so successful at occupying another with relatively so few casualties, ongoing casualties, I'll say, compared to other occupations for over 60 years. So there is this concept of a work permit incentives. So work permits are offered to West Bank Palestinians, and they require renewal by the Israeli authorities every 3 months. And so one of the key ways that this helps control the Palestinian population is that once, say, someone is comfortable with getting these work permit offers, they are planning for their future, planning for their kids' education, they get recruited to give names about and inform about who else is involved in a demonstration, or do you know anyone who leaked this or that? Do you know anyone organizing? These names don't even have to be true. It can just be a neighbor that maybe a neighbor for any reason. Whether they were actually involved in demonstration or not, it is still effective in controlling the population and sowing distrust among the social fabric. MCW estimates 20 to 60% of West Bank Palestinians have become collaborators, which again, essentially destroys the social fabric and trust. Even if intelligence received as faulty, the system still works well. The arrest experienced by children is traumatizing, to say the least. And so for so many Palestinian children, it's in PTSD, it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, it is ongoing. It is still so present. Palestinian children are continued to be traumatized in horrible ways. And this trauma will be intergenerational and impact these children for decades to come. So upon arrest, and they're usually in the dead of night, can be 2 or 3 a.m. We met with families that talked about waking up to breathing in their room at 3 a.m. and to just be surrounded by heavily armed Israeli soldiers who are often teenagers themselves, or young, or like maybe 20, 21 years old. Sometimes they will begin arrest, or sometimes they just might stay silent and leave without saying anything. This is a common Israeli drill. But in the case that an arrest is carried out, whether there was some link to an actual demonstration or not, there's no security reason for keeping the children blindfolded, but blindfolding often softens up a child for interrogation, especially right after waking up. Then they're left for about 5 to 10 hours to stew, and then this is again easier to get a confession, and usually don't have to use physical abuse as much in this case. The interrogation and confession manipulations, usually about 10 hours after they are taken from their home forcibly, the interrogation begins. And in these 10 hours, soldiers are assigned to ensure that the children cannot fall asleep. They may be physically beaten randomly or just kind of poked awake. And under international military law, they do have a right to silence and they do have the right to consult a lawyer. But in most cases, that is not offered to them. Here is more about the night raids that I mentioned earlier. Night raids, and this was a really important part for the Israeli authorities to implement, is that they always happen within 48 hours if anyone resists Israeli control in any way, including peaceful protests. Again, they're usually in the middle of the night to avoid starting a riot in the day. And again, here's a testimony of different Palestinian families experiencing this ongoing terror every day while living in the West Bank. So sowing despair is also fear and intimidation and the work permits. This is a direct quote from, I think, David, one of the lawyers talking with us, that without this engineering of despair, there is no other way to be so successful at occupying a territory for 55 years with such a low casualty rate. The cost is obviously huge, with a devastating psychological impact on these innocent children. Children become deeply mistrustful of authoritative figures around them, as children are being forced to confess things they did not do. And in recent years, it's really gotten worse. Solitary confinement, one of these notorious horrible tools, is growing in its use on children. There was maybe 8% estimated by MCW 2018, which jumped to 42% in 2022. And who knows on its rates today in 2023. And as we know, as peacemakers, inflicting violence on a population does not only affect the population experiencing the violence, it also affects the perpetrators. There are different organizations like Breaking the Silence, which talks about soldiers' testimonies and them trying to speak out and trying to generate opposition to occupation after going through the experience of being a soldier. There's also the Refuser Solidarity Network, where we see young Israelis refusing to enlist, even though they risk imprisonment. This is another quote from David himself, finding plenty of humanity in soldiers, decent people entering Israeli systems and coming out aggressive, angry and aggressive. There's a very abusive internal dynamics within the army, from elder to younger soldiers. And another quote that stuck with me from him is that the danger is that plenty of good people fill evil systems. So there is growing resistance, and I think especially the Refuser Solidarity Network is a beacon of hope in recent times, at least another one. So that was quite heavy. The issues in Palestine are ongoing for generations now. And as you may have seen in the news recently, there have been increased military destruction in Jenin. And there's a call to action here in this link that I'll share in the chat shortly. In July of 2023, the Israeli military is preventing ambulances from reaching critically injured Palestinians, damaging infrastructure like electricity and water, ripping up roads and bulldozing homes, even attacking the Jenin Freedom Theater, where families were seeking refuge and has been a sign for community and hope for many years. Another possible call to action on things to do is this opportunity in DC area next week. Dr. Abasor is someone who is another shining inspiration example of what it means to be nonviolent and in beautiful resistance, in his words, even under these extraordinary circumstances, using art and literature and many different programs. He keeps the community together and focused on a better future. And so he'll be at Buff Boys and Poets next Tuesday and at a church in Bethesda on Monday. And I'll share more info about that in the chat as well. All right, so here's some additional resources, but now I wanted to take the time to make room for comment and discussion as well. Ask Sister Susan about her time in Palestine, Israel as well, and any impressions that she has had as she was there for 6 months with the Council of World Churches.
Thank you, Jessica, for this good presentation and very precise. I mean, everything that was on the video and your own sharing of your experience it's a daily occurrence. And some stories that when you hear them or even witness what is happening, it just does not make sense in your mind, because you are seeing a horrible thing happening and you cannot put a human being in that, doing that action to another person. So like even arresting kids when they go to arrest a child in the city of Jerusalem, whole city of Jerusalem, kids going to school and they've not committed any crime at all will be stopped and searched. And a soldier puts their body on a kid while they are searching him, mostly boys, teenage boys. And another one just empties the contents of the backpack on the ground and kicks this child, kicks a child for no reason at all. And after all that, they will just ask them, pick up your bag. And then they have to pick up their papers, their books, everything, and then go to school. How does a child concentrate in education? So many of them have become dropouts because they cannot handle it anymore. But the parents and the teachers keep saying, it will end. It will end. So the aspect of the Palestinians' hope and the steadfastness, which they call simud, it's just not steadfastness, it's beyond, because going through humiliation, brutality, and dehumanization being every time they see their terrorists. When you speak to the Israeli soldiers or mostly the Israeli soldiers, because those are the people that we sometimes kind of interacted with. They say the terrorists, and say, no, they are not terrorists. They are human beings. They are just human as you and I. And then they tell us that they've learned to hate each other. So we have to keep peace. We have to we have to keep peace. We have to protect people. But who are the people? The Israelis, but not the Palestinians. So it was just really difficult to see that. And the tactics are just so many that it's impossible to describe in a session. One of the things that was said in the movie is about the land being vacant. And so because of the war, many people have been separated from their land. And they are given like a week to plant and a week to harvest. So in the spring, they will go to plant. And then in the fall, they will be given a week to harvest. But they cannot bring any vehicle. They cannot bring, and so, and of course because then they see overgrown grass, then they say that land is vacant. Therefore, it is taken away. There are so many underlying tactics to just make sure that the Palestinians do not have a piece of land. And when using a religion, like this is an archaeological site, the bones of a prophet so-and-so are believed to be here, so we are going to excavate. They begin a little excavation. The next thing is a outpost is put up there, and then it becomes a settlement. So there's so many things that being used systematically to take away the land, and dispossess people of their lives. So I won't go in deep into that because you really did a good job.
Thank you so much, Sister Susan. I really want to open up to the floor for any questions, comments, feelings, discussion. I see in the chat, John Holden shared about a statement 4 days ago from the Churches for Middle East Peace about the raids in Jenin. It states the Biden administration must ensure U.S. military aid and defense articles are not used to destroy civilian infrastructure and injure or kill civilians. As long as the US continues to provide aid without any conditions, the Israeli military will act with impunity. And we've seen this a lot with regards to Israeli authorities acting with impunity towards US requests, even though the state of Israel is, I think, the largest item in our defense budget in like the past few decades. We've seen that with Israeli authorities refusing to comply with the FBI in their investigation into the murder of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and other instances. Donna, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, Jessica, this issue is very close to my heart too. I'm just wondering what, there's so much information, it's so blatant. I was thinking about recommended actions. I have a question for young people who would, maybe they are familiar with Birthright that was on college campuses, you know, trying to recruit Jewish students to, you know, to go to Israel and you know, sort of join the movement, really. I just wondered if that was something familiar to people, and also, so this one House bill was mentioned, No Way to Treat a Child Act. I'm just wondering if there are other, I don't know what we can do. I mean, as Americans with our own government, I mean, you know, what can we do to stop this, you know, the flow of funds to Israel and to, you know, have a more authentic relationship with them?
Right, Donna, I think you nailed it on the head. So I hit the nail on the head. One of the great ways we can participate is reaching out to our Congress people to ask them to support these kind of baseline bills in regards to the humane treatment of Palestinian children, or at least not actively providing funding for military raids that destroy civilian areas, especially harming children. And so John Holden has added a link there for the No Way to Treat a Child Act. A little bit above is a link to the report from Janine and a call to action where it's like a one-click message to your federal Congress members at the bottom. Jewish Voices for Peace is also a wonderful organization in the States, the fastest growing Jewish organization stateside that has great action alerts, awesome, a lot of one-click opportunities to get involved. So I highly recommend that organization and potentially signing up for their action alerts as well. Another great way is to get connected to your local Palestinian groups, because in the past few years, we've seen a lot of efforts to pass bills or resolutions in state legislatures to basically criminalize if any government contractor participates in the criticism of the state of Israel, to block them from being a state contractor or getting any kind of state funds. We've seen famous cases in Texas with a news publication and going up to courts with that. Right, 37 states so far. Thank you, Anne. So that's another great way to get involved and also meet a lot of wonderful community organizers locally. Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, of which I see at least one familiar face here from there, is how I eventually learned about Pax Christi in the first place as well. So really great organizers working on Palestine in many states across America. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Jessica.
I think also one other thing is encouraging the members of Congress to come up with a bill for accountability, because for the money the US is giving to Israel, because they give the money, of course, there's a condition, it's not supposed to be used for human rights violation, for expansion of settlements, but has anybody ever done a report to show that it wasn't? And many of the things, of course, it's given as $3.8 billion is given every year to Israel as military aid. That's why Israel is able to send 1,000 soldiers to a 0.2 space, plus accompanied by thousands of, tens of areas where ammunitions and all kind of things, because they have that money just to use on Palestinians, on using the name national security or counterterrorism. I mean, how can you do that? But is the US doing any accountability follow-up about that? So maybe encouraging the members of Congress to propose a bill, and then after that ask others to support it, so that Israel can be held accountable to all the crimes it's committing on the people. I mean, it's not only the Palestinians, of course, many peace activists that we worked with, they get harassed and beaten and because of their support for Palestinians or for human rights.
Thank you, Sister Susan. Mary, I see your hand.
I have a friend who is a Jewish rabbi, and he and I communicate sometimes via his Facebook page. And I was just imagining, dreaming, I guess, about how we might have a conversation because rabbis are very powerful. You know, I see his following on his Facebook page, and lots of posts from Israel and lots of smiling faces. So that's just something that is running around in my mind right now.
Absolutely. I'd love to see more interfaith dialogue on this huge human rights and peace and justice issue. And I've been very encouraged by some rabbis joining with Jewish Voices for Peace. That's the main organization I know where rabbis can speak out, but there's also a lot of people on this call who have been in this work for decades. So if any of you also have suggestions on how we can facilitate such an interfaith dialogue like that happening in our area, please unmute and let us know. Betsy? Oh, Betsy, you're still muted.
Okay. I can't help but ask a question about tourism there. I have some friends who would very much like to go to visit that area or to go back because they've been there. And I'm wondering, how can one legitimately travel to that area, to a place where people may think they are the chosen people, when it seems so limited from the image many have of Jesus? And also, is there any way that tourists are doing anything positive in the Palestinian areas? It doesn't sound like it would be very easy to travel there. So can you just say something about the possibility of travel?
Right. So I had a great experience with Friends of Sabeel North America, Sabeel, going as a tourist, really. We got to see all the wonderful sites with the Nativity Church, the place where Jesus was allegedly crucified, and so much more. So we got a lot of tours from local Palestinians, which added so much richness to the history of different areas we were walking around, whether it was Hebron or Jerusalem or Bethlehem. So I highly recommend Sabeel, reaching out with them. But if anyone knows any other great travel organizations, awesome. Thank you, Anne. We have Friends of Sabeel North America, just mentioned, Tree of Life Educational Fund, Green Olive, Eyewitness Palestine. So there's definitely still a great way to see all of these religious landmarks and areas that are so important to us as Christians. Thank you, Betsy.
Thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Great job by you and Susan. A couple of comments. I know Pax Christi USA is thinking about putting together a visit to Palestine and next year. So that's one thing. And be very careful though of if you do go visit, because if you go to with some of the groups, you would end up feeding more into the Zionist apartheid narrative. So be careful, if you do go. I think it is good to go, but there's a lot of good organizations to go with. Just be careful about that. Sister Susan was talking to, there's a law, a lot of you may remember in the 1980s when the US government was on the wrong side of most of the wars in Central America, and we were arming oppressive governments. There was the Leahy Amendment was passed, and under the Leahy Amendment, the United States is not supposed to supply military aid to any countries that are, violating human rights or using that military aid to hurt civilians. And unfortunately, though, one of the groups that I worked with was working with the State Department for 3 or 4 years on trying to get the State Department to use the Leahy Amendment with Israel, Palestine. But the outcome at that point was that basically Israel is the exception to the unwritten exceptions to the Leahy Amendment. They basically refuse. So again, we just have to do more to continue to put pressure. While things on the ground in Israel is getting worse, one of the positive things is it's opening up everybody's eyes in this country a little more. So if we keep on putting more pressure on Congress, it would be good.